For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Motshabi Hoaeane. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner examines the role of popular power in South Africa's democracy. Thank you, Professor, for your time. In your column, you refer to popular democracy. Is it realistic to advocate that in the 21st century? And where do you see the possibilities for popular action in our particular context?
Yeah, it's quite a controversial question, but I think people tend to forget that the original meaning of democracy was actually popular action. The demos is the people, kratia is power, and that was where the word came from in ancient Athens, and people like Aristotle and Plato were opposed to democracy. And democracy was actually a very unpopular term for many centuries. And it was because it was a system that was hostile to the powers of lords and kings and people like that. And it only started to change and become treated as a norm which we should all adhere to in the last few centuries, especially after the American Revolution. Now, what happened with the American Revolution? It was a popular revolution in many respects, but when they made the Constitution, they introduced the concept of representative democracy. Now, there's a late Nigerian scholar, Claude Ake, who says the word representative democracy is a contradiction in terms, because democracy means direct action of the people, and representative democracy is indirect. Now, in history, but also in South African history, you have got examples of popular action, popular democracy. In the Mpondo rebellion in the late 50s, early 60s, you have the 1980s in South Africa, many examples of what were called elementary organs of people's power. Now, there's some people who find this very frightening. Some scholars who write about the masses and are comfortable with the masses in archives. But when there was actual mass power in the 1980s, people organizing in streets, in blocks, what was called the popular power period, they found this fearsome. And people like myself who supported and still support popular power have to recognize that popular power doesn't always work. There are cases of abuses, there are cases of necklacing, there are cases of violence against people of various kinds. So what is important is to say, yes, popular power is practical. I will argue why, but it doesn't always work. It tends to work when the whole community are involved in the decision and when it is not political partisanship. For example, the one place I like to refer to is Port Alfred, where there was very successful popular organization and mobilization. It was successful because the entire community was involved, not just the youth, but students, women's organizations, trade unions, and members of the civic. So you had a cross-generational involvement. It's very important to have older people, because older people tend to be less impetuous. Young people like to see results early. If you throw a stone, you can see an immediate result. But older people understand that if you want to build something that endures in a community, you need to build slowly and patiently, to go to people and explain to them, okay, we want to have a consumer boycott. This is why we do it. Now, when you have a consumer boycott, you're going to ask people to make sacrifices, to not buy something that they need. So if you want them to do this, you can either enforce it by violence, by making them swallow what they've bought, and they may have to swallow washing powder, for example, or you can convince them that it's desirable. And what I believe was happening in a place like Port Alfred is when people were going off to work, when there was a strike or some such thing, some little boy would be in a tree and say, "Uncle, where are you going to?" or something like that. So there would be attempts to prevent them, but not the use of violence. Now, late in the 1980s, there were a succession of states of emergency, and what happened is the most experienced older people tended to be arrested. And as a result, younger people were left behind, and there was an infiltration of tsotsis, what were called tsotsis, into these organizations. But even, in the environment of many townships, there was a sort of grey area between being a comrade and being a tsotsi, and there are many people who could have gone in the rest of their lives along the tsotsi trajectory and did in fact later join MK or something like that. So that we have to recognize that when you don't have the restraints of a broad-based organization because of the repression, well then it is easier for abuses like violence and necklacing to occur. So we have to have a typology. We have to say, does it have a value today? We know that in places like Yeovil, they have street committees now, and they didn't have street committees in the 1980s because they found this is a good way of containing conflict, addressing conflict in communities. Also, in broader society, Anthony R. Blaster, who's written a book called Democracy, asks whether it's applicable to Britain today. And he says, with modern means of IT, you can communicate in a way that was only possible in small villages in the past. So it's quite possible, if we want to have communication with people all over the country and realize popular power in that way.
Well, Professor, how do you understand the relationship between NGOs and popular action?
See, NGOs are not popular organizations in themselves, but they can play a catalytic role which can advance popular organizations through the resources that they have. They can have funding, they can provide training, they can provide skills and transfer skills and make it possible for some organizations to succeed rather than others, or to make all organizations that come into their purview successful. If you want to have a meeting of a grassroots organization, you may have to transport people from a number of places. Where do you get the money for that? You may need a venue. How do you hire a venue if you don't have a venue? You may need literature. How do you get literature prepared and printed? You may need food if people are there for the day. Where do you get the money for this? Say you do have a meeting. How do you run a meeting? To be a chair of a meeting is a skill. It's a skill that we know the trade unions teach people as they become more and more involved. And many of the NGOs in the 1980s, like the Human Awareness Program, used to train people on how to organize, how to chair a meeting, how to fundraise, and a range of things. So the NGOs are quite important, and I think there is an opportunity and there's also a danger, because when you have NGOs that have a particular political orientation, they may decide to pour their resources into some organizations and not into others. And those who do not get funding can be in trouble. Like Abahlali we referred to, they get very little financial assistance, and they are also subject to repression. So that we have to ask, why is it that more funding and more resources, expertise are not directed there? Why is it that certain others get a lot of resources? Also, some of the foundations that give funding to NGOs, are they monitoring where the money goes, how it is used, and whether it is helping in a non-sectarian way? And NGOs, I think, are very important, but it's important that NGOs should subject themselves to the democratic values of the organizations that they assist, not be there to tell them what to do. I don't say they do this, but some do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your insights, as always. That was Professor Raymond Suttner on the consent of the governed and South Africa's democratic character.